an email that I received 4 years ago. It'll be 4 years in September, I believe. And I've never done the story because it's so long and detailed, but it's the absolute oldest email in my inbox. And I went to the oldest email in my inbox and I thought, I'm going to do this story. This will be one podcast, one long story. I hope you enjoy it. All right, here we go. Dear Mr. Dixiecryptid, I've lived on this property for 45 years now. It was around 2003 that I ever considered that Bigfoot may also live in my holler. I live in the southwestern part of West Virginia. By God, West Virginia! I now know many people in my state have seen and heard these creatures. Let me say that I have not seen these animals, but I hear them often. I've also seen tracks in the snow around my house on 2 occasions. Due to their size, it could not be anything else in my opinion. I have seen tracks in the garden also. I have family members that live in my hollow that have seen them. Most of those encounters were after dark, and a couple were in daylight hours. Let me tell you how it all began for me. I was divorced after 30 years of marriage and raising 3 children. It was difficult living alone in a big house that backed up to the woods. All the bedrooms were on the 2nd level. The exterior windowless wall of my bedroom that was near the woods is above and to the side of the cellar. The cellar sits a couple of feet lower than the floor of my bedroom. One fall in the early morning hours, around 3 a.m., I was sleeping soundly, but I was awakened by a sound no more than 3 to 4 feet to the exterior wall of my bedroom. I couldn't wrap my head around the sound of something pulling up from what I knew to be the cement top of the cellar 2 feet below the floor and some 9 feet to the top of the metal roof over my bedroom. That's a reach of 11 feet plus. I could hear what I guessed was the underbelly of an animal scraping on the metal edge of the roof. After pulling itself up, it stood and proceeded to take a large, widely spaced bipedal step to the other end of my house, which is 42 feet from where it pulled up. That would be steps, not step. I was lying in the bed, cowering under the bed covers, listening and hardly breathing. And then it walked back over my bed, but it did not jump the 11 feet down to the cellar the way it came up. Instead, it walked directly over my bed and apparently pushed off the edge over the only window in my bedroom, and it dropped 20 feet to what I call the pebble patio. The headboard of my bed sat directly under this window above the pebble patio, and my window shook so violently that I feared it would break and fall inwardly on me, still lying in bed. Even worse, that the animal would somehow gain access to me all the time. My heart raced inside my chest because of the extreme fear I felt. I laid there awake, but I heard nothing more. I waited for the daylight so I could leave my house to go down to the hill to my mother's house to let family know what had happened to me and see if we could make sense of it all. My brothers just laughed at me when I demonstrated the gait of the animal when I spread my legs apart as far as I could to take a step, but it was not far enough. From that night on, I began searching online what kind of an animal walks on your roof, and that's when I discovered that I was not alone in my experience. I can't prove that Bigfoot walked on my roof, but given how it happened, I can't explain it any other way, and thus began my armchair campaign to become educated about Bigfoot. A few years after the roof walking experience, my son and daughter were on top of the roof installing a new antenna. And when my son came into the kitchen, he said that I must have a big bird leaving droppings on my roof. Well, I asked what he meant. He said there was a big pile of animal feces near the fireplace chimney. I couldn't get much more information out of my son, so I instructed my daughter to pay attention and to give me a detailed report when she came down. She told me that there was a pile of feces, and it was white, the size of a large dinner plate. When I asked what the shape looked like, she said it was circular, like a big cinnamon roll. I immediately thought of the creature that had walked to the fireplace end of the house and back and sprang so far down to the pebble patio. And when I expressed that to my kids, they had a good laugh at my expense. There have been many over the years. I remembered the old TV show In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. My only awareness of the possible existence of the animal known as Bigfoot was on that show. Well, I believed it was possible, but it didn't affect me, or so I thought, since it was a West Coast possibility. That was 40 years prior to my experience, and I began listening to everything I could about Bigfoot. That's when I began to put together things that had happened here over the years. For example, a number of years prior to my experience, my ex-husband and I were helping my brother's family build an addition onto their house. In the evenings, we would hear a peculiar noise far up into the hollow that was a dead end above his property. It was some type of moaning and bellowing cry. I'd never heard anything like it before, nor since those days that I spent there. And although both myself and my brother have both heard very strange calls, yells, and noises since then, after the walking on my roof episode, I recall some things that had happened over the years in my hollow. And I'm now convinced that the Bigfoot were in this hollow before we ever called it home. It had been many years prior to our moving onto this land that humans had lived here. My mother and stepfather always raised large gardens. On 2 separate occasions and 2 separate summers, my stepfather went out to harvest a crop for canning, and it was all gone, taken during the night. Once it was fresh corn, and another time it was his ripe tomatoes. It was all stripped clean. We had an above-ground swimming pool for our kids while they were growing up, and I was standing by the window looking out at the pool, and I couldn't understand why I didn't see any water. I went out to investigate. The sides of the pool lining had deep gashes in it, and the water had nearly all leaked out. The sides were not caved in, so whatever took a swim had entered and departed from the small deck where the ladder was located. At the time, I thought perhaps since it was August and the creeks were dry, that a bear had taken a little swim. Who knows? It could have been the Bigfoot instead. Here are some other strange things that happened here at my house. I've had artificial plants moved from where I had them in a window box at one end of my house and left in my driveway at the other end of my house, and it was not weather related. I've had a drain cover removed many times. I will replace it, and it is taken off again. I've been gifted with objects. Once a child's metal bracelet, obviously weathered and old, was left in the middle of my front sidewalk, so that when I left I would have to see it. I've had my screen door opened and a beautiful but dead yellow bird in the middle of my welcome mat. I've had my artificial flowers removed from outdoor wreaths and placed inside my screen porch. I had a wooden arbor with climbing roses broken all to pieces and being tossed into the driveway. My beautiful roses were totally uprooted, and this happened in one summer night. My mother lived with me for 5 years. She slept downstairs in a nook. She had to use her potty chair often, and she had a habit of walking to the doorway where she stood to see out the window into the pebble patio. One morning when I came downstairs, she had something to tell me. By this time, I was leaving all my outside lights on since the years before when something bipedal walked on my roof. She said that she walked to the doorway, and when she looked out, she saw a big, hairy back. No head because it was above the window. When I asked what she did, she said she quietly backed up and eased back into the bed as quietly as she could. And after that, I put the window shades on all the downstairs windows. In fact, I have window shades on all the windows, and they are drawn tight before dark every evening. My brother and I used to play guitars and write songs, and my brother came up and I handed him a guitar, and he began playing while I went back inside for something. The dogs had been barking like crazy, and just as I stepped onto the screen porch to hear this newly written song, we heard the most terrifying scream. It was an angry scream. It was louder than any lion roar and deeper in resonance than any bull, and it ended in a guttural growl. My brother said, "What was that?" I knew it wasn't a dog, but I said, I guess it was just a dog. And about that time it yelled again, and it sounded like it was close. My brother said that wasn't a dog. The dogs had gone completely silent at that time. We walked to the sidewalk and we listened, but we didn't hear anything else. My brother said he was going home, and I said I was going inside and locking the doors, and that is what we did. I've never heard that exact sound again, but I have heard other vocals, actually too many to recount. I've heard too many wood knocks to recount. I've heard the death noise of a deer after hearing a wood knock a little way away, and then out at the end of my yard hearing another wood knock and the obvious sound of a deer dying. For a long time I would hear wood knocks and try to explain to my brother what it sounded like, and he would call me and I would go out on my porch and listen. It took a while, but one day he called and I went outside, and yes, it was a wood knock, and after that he learned to tell the difference. I explained their knocks as a Louisville slugger hitting a tree in such a powerful way that no human can duplicate it, and it sounds like it vibrates from the inside out with such force. I've also had my doorbell ring and no one being there. I've had my house slapped. I've heard something heavy step onto my deck, especially when I used to have pets and I fed them in the evenings. I learned to feed in the mornings. I've had walnuts thrown at me from a hillside, and my friend that was visiting me had persimmons thrown at her from the hillside too. There are no persimmons near my house. I've heard clacking rocks in the fall that made me think of cracking walnuts. And as I'm getting older and I'm outside less, I don't hear as much as I used to, but I still hear them hunting or calling out to each other, even twice this past week. I always marvel as to why my neighbors aren't hearing this. Two of these neighbors are a son and a grandson and their family, and they sleep with a fan going so they don't hear what I hear. My brother has a lot of dogs that bark all night long. They get quiet when the Bigfoots are around. Actually, I've heard a pattern of travel, the dogs barking at the neighbors as the Bigfoots get close, and those dogs go quiet. And that pattern continues to the next house, and so forth and so on. It is my belief that they travel up and down the winding creeks on each side of the hollow so as not to be detected. I think the Bigfoot's home is far up in the hollow above the property my brother owns and used to live in. There are many caves and rock cliffs in the area. My nephews that hunt up in there tell me that there is a place they have their own name for, and they say they get goosebumps every time they are in there. They also say things don't seem right up there. It's the only place in the hollow they feel that way about. And my brother used to live in that hollow and moved into my mom's house at the bottom of my hill years ago. His son was the last one to live alone in the other house. He used to have a lot of slapping on the house walls, and one night all the firewood that my brother had stacked on his screen porch up there was all knocked down. It made my brother angry, and he yelled out into the woods, "This isn't funny and I don't like this. You've made me angry." And then it never happened again. There have been several things happen in that hollow besides the yelling we heard so many years ago when adding on to a house and the slapping on the house his son heard. Before my brother's son moved into his house, our youngest brother relocated back to West Virginia from Georgia. He and his sons hunted deer and gutted the animals in the back, and the gut piles would be taken. They had rocks and logs thrown at them when they hunted, and a couple of the boys were sitting on the screened-in porch one night with their flashlights, and they heard something across the creek bank, and they went to investigate and shine their lights on a group of Bigfoots. They saw them. One was on all fours near the creek, and they said it growled and did a backward crawl so fast, not unlike the movement of a spider. And I tried to get the other details about hair color, etc., and they just said a couple were dark and one was dirty white or gray. It happened so fast, I think, that they wanted to just get out of there. These animals had the hollow to themselves for so long that I think they resented the family living there and taking game. And even to this day, many of the vocals come from that hollow or one or the other side of my hill. My brother and his wife that lived down the hill from me were on their back porch one summer evening a few years ago, and they heard what they could only describe as fighting within a bunch of these creatures. They said it was chilling. My brother called me, but by the time I opened my window, the sounds had stopped. 10 years ago, this same brother's little grandson explained to his grandpa that he saw a monster, and he said it was tall with brown hair. Another time, his grandmother let him play on the back screened-in porch while she worked in the kitchen, and she came to check on him often. She said that a little brown one was about as tall as him came to the porch and wanted his stuffed dog, but he wouldn't let him have it. He said it smiled at him and it had big teeth like his grandpa's teeth. And when his grandmother came to check on him, he said it ran over to the nearby creek bank and it lay down in the grass. When asked if he was afraid of it, he said, "No, he was my friend." But he was so afraid of the monster in the creek that when he left his grandparents' house, his grandpa had to carry him and put him in his car seat. That was the way he did for many months. One of my neighbors is my cousin, and she said one night that she took her dog out to use the bathroom. Now this dog is a biter, and it went charging at something on the hill as it crossed the driveway. The dog came to an abrupt stop when she saw what it was, and my cousin swears that it sounded like the creature in a very deep, drawn-out voice, too deep for a human, and it gave a command to the dog saying, "Down." She said her dog dropped to her haunches. My cousin called the dog back and got back inside the house. My cousin said the creature wasn't too bulky, but it was tall and kind of lanky like a large basketball player. This was my cousin's second sighting, as she thinks she saw one when she was a tiny girl on the same property. Her sister, who lived with her, said one night that their house was hit so hard that one of the foundation blocks was cracked, and that cousin slept with her gun at the ready at all times. My second-born brother lives across from my oldest brother's place up in the hollow, and one night he went out to smoke on the porch. He looked across at our brother's place, and he thought our brother was standing there with a toboggan on his head with his arms crossed across his chest, looking toward the hillside. They were always teasing each other, as brothers do, and he yelled out, "What are you doing over there, you big dummy?" He said a creature popped up and ran like a deer on an old logging road and went out of sight. My brother then figured out it wasn't our brother that he had seen. Other nights, my brother was recovering from surgery and was lying in a recliner. It was a rainy April night, and he saw a Bigfoot standing under the light post looking at my brother through the window, which had no curtains or window shades. They got a window shade after that, and their daughter saw a whitish-colored Bigfoot which threw a rock at her when she opened the door to get a better look. That scared her to death. Another time, she saw red eyes looking at her in the bedroom window, and they heard strange yells often. One night, her husband hid a tape recorder on the porch and got a recording of the creature yelling. He tried to find something that sounded like it online, but he could not find a match. Our neighbor that lives on a hill within eyesight of both my oldest brother and my house told my brother some of his experiences. Prior to moving there, his dad lived there. The old man was dying of cancer, but he told his son something that was hanging around the house. His son thought he was delusional due to the medications that he was on, but a couple of things happened before and after the death of his father. The old man had been a victim of robbery a couple of times in the past, and one night he heard what he thought was a prowler, so he came out letting go of both barrels. Whatever it was ran away, and the old man got up the next morning to quite a sight. His four-wheeler was thrown up in the woods, as was his lawnmower, his tools, his gas tanks, and everything else. After the old man died, his son continued to come to the house, keeping a lookout on the property and feeding his dad's dog. He fed the dog that night, as well as giving him some outdated bakery bread. And then he went inside to check on some things, and the dog began to bark and carry on, and then it sounded like it was in pain. and the son came out to see what was going on, and he shined the light to see a Bigfoot, hands full of bread, and it growled and took off around the hillside. The dog had been tossed up on the hillside, and after that the son said the dog left and he couldn't get it to stay there again. I can't say I blame him, I would have left too. This same person told my brother he started tracking these animals and he found bone piles, and that he had set up a game cam to get photos, and he showed those to my brother. My brother said the whole face was covered in dark hair. My brother, like myself, has listened to Bigfoot programming for years, and when our neighbor divulged his plans in regards to Bigfoot, my brother gave him some good advice, telling him to let them be, or he could be bringing great harm to himself. This man's cousin lives down the road from him, and one night had a creature pounding on his trailer so violently, the girl living with him left him, refusing to stay there any longer. And after that, he put up a lot of lights trying to discourage such visitations. On that neighbor's hill is where my oldest brother had his morning encounter at 10 a.m. about 3 or 4 years ago. He topped a hill, and the creature was so engrossed in watching the neighbor's trailer that he turned and saw my brother's car. He had a deer in the headlights look, and he gave one jump over the creek bank, and by the time my brother got there, it slithered around a big boulder and it vanished. My brother was so shocked. He wondered if our neighbor was practicing karaoke, which he does often, and the creature was caught up in listening to that and didn't hear the car. Oh my gosh. Imagine having a neighbor practicing karaoke in his trailer. Anyway, my brother said it was dark and the creature had a hairy face, and it was bulky and not huge, but it was very tall. It had huge eyes. Its mouth was closed, so he didn't see its teeth. He said it moved so fast that it was nearly a blur. 3 years ago up in the holler, my niece and her husband had taken my mom to my brother's for dinner. They were trying to load her into her car to take her back to the nursing home where she is a resident at 91 years of age. They were having a hard time, and when my niece heard something growling and making a lot of noise walking down the creek in the dark, my niece began yelling for her husband to get Mama into the car. She started pushing her backside to rush the process. My mother is nearly deaf and had no idea what we were trying to do, and my niece was especially frightened because many years before, her dad had something similar happen to him, and in the same location. My brother had been remodeling their home and went out late one night to burn the old building debris, and something came down the creek stomping and growling. The fire had nearly died down at that point, and my brother built the fire up again, and he was scared, and he was standing there late at night in the dark with no weapon. All the things I've heard or came to know about in the neighborhood has profoundly changed me in how I do things. There is no doubt I'm fearful. And because I live in a rural area on a hill, I didn't used to have window shades, but I do now. And I didn't think twice about coming home at night, and I have to be in before dark now. I realized there had been many opportunities whereby we could have been harmed by these creatures, but luckily we haven't been. To be honest, I pray every night not to ever see these creatures. I'm perfectly happy not to see them. I'm sure they've seen me, though. I've been made fun of by my kids and grandchildren, but they don't listen or open their minds. I think the day will come when they will have to know that the Bigfoots are real. One of my granddaughters called me around midnight back in the fall. She had opened her bedroom window and was hearing sounds up in the hollow that she had never heard, and they scared her. She has also admitted to me that when she gets home from work late at night, she runs to the house from the driveway. I'm sorry for the length of this email. A lot has gone on over the years. You can refer to me as Sydney, but please don't use my last name. It would be a further embarrassment to my children. Well, Sydney, that was, man, you and your family have been through a lot of stuff, and that was a good email. I thought this was a good story. I appreciate the woman sending it. I'm sorry it took 4 years to get it, but I've got a bunch of them to do. and I'm going to try to get to every one of them. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you guys on the next podcast. Thanks.